the years, I have gotten pretty good at pacing myself for 12-minute conference talks. A 1 hour talk is an unusual abundance of time. So, and this is also, I should say, still a work in progress, very much work in progress. And it would be great to get people's ideas on various aspects of what I've been working on. So don't be shy about suggesting that I try something different. I will go ahead and start with a little bit of background. There have been a number of studies that show that money matters, that increases in per pupil spending have resulted in increased student outcomes, raising average levels of achievement and improving learning gains, particularly for disadvantaged students. So some of the studies that are listed here, La Fortune uses an event study design that exploits the randomness of timing in school finance reform, and NAEP data to assess the impact of post-1990 school finance reforms on absolute and relative spending and achievement in low-income school districts. And then the next study on here shows that 7 years after reform, the highest poverty quartile schools in a treated state experience about a 12% increase in per pupil spending and a 7 to 12 percentage point increase in graduation rates. The Hyman study is of Michigan's 1994 school finance reform, Proposal A. In that one, students were exposed to $1,000 or a 10% increase in spending were 3 percentage points more likely to enroll in college and 2.3 percentage points more likely to earn a post-secondary degree. And in this case, this is the one that was said in Michigan, effects were actually concentrated among lower poverty and higher achieving districts. The district targeted the marginal dollar towards schools serving less poor populations within the district. The Rothstein and Whitmore paper reformed increased high school completion and college going, concentrated among Black students and women, and raised annual earnings. They also increased the return to education, particularly for Black students and men, which was driven by the return to high school. And then finally, the last paper is an event study and instrumental variable model show that a 10% increase in per pupil spending each year for all 12 years of public school lead to about 0.3 more completed years of education, about 7% higher wages, and about a 3 percentage point reduction in the annual incidence of adult poverty. And the effects are much more pronounced for children from low income families. So there's been lots of work drawing on these school finance reforms. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the definitions that I'm using in this particular work. First of all, equity means a lot of different things to different people. And ultimately, one of the directions that I'm starting to move towards is thinking about adequacy as well as equity. But the Code of Maryland Regulations has a definition that the Maryland State Department of Education uses. So to frame this in the local political context, I've borrowed from that definition. So educational equity, meaning every student has access to opportunities, resources, and educational rigor that they need throughout their educational career to maximize academic success and social emotional well-being, and to view each student's individual characteristics as valuable. So next, there's efficiency. What does it mean to be efficient? How would we know if districts were spending funds efficiently? So I have two different ways of thinking about this. The first one, the maximization of education outcomes for a given quantity of inputs. And then second, and this is kind of how I end up operationalizing it, is a proxy for district efficiency is the expenditure-to-performance ratio, the ratio of per pupil expenditures to student academic performance or other outcomes. It could be, in the paper that's cited here, they use, I think, 4 or 5 different ratios. So you can use different outcomes. And in Maryland's accountability system includes data on a lot of different outcomes. So we could imagine a number of different ways to calculate this. So the school finance reforms that were referenced in the literature review, those were driven by the adequacy movement of the 1990s. We might say that funding is adequate if we get the outcomes that we want. But if the money is spent inefficiently, that would drive up what adequate looks like. And on the other hand, we might get the outcomes that we want because of factors other than efficient school spending. Things like social safety nets, parents hiring tutors, so there might be some hidden subsidization of the educational expenditures. The school finance data indicators compares state and local per pupil spending in each state to the estimated amount of money required to achieve national average test scores. And in Jennifer King Rice's work, she identified two conditions that have to be met for adequacy. One is that the state ensures the school systems have a level of resources that are consistent with an adequate education. And the second is that the school systems have to use those resources efficiently to realize the specified level of knowledge and skills. Another thing I'll add here is that, so this definition has an emphasis on both inputs and outcomes, right? And that for the purposes of this work, I've been thinking about adequate as whether most students are proficient on the state assessment for two reasons. One is that if the national average test scores aren't great, then the average might not be the best bar for adequacy. And the other is that it situates the work in the local context and focuses on a measure of achievement that state and local policymakers care about. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit of background about Maryland. The Office of Policy Analysis in Maryland has a report that says to achieve adequacy, state and local funding must be sufficient to acquire the total resources needed to reasonably expect that all students can meet academic performance standards. So that speaks again to that definition of adequacy that I talked about in the previous slide. And this chart here is from that school finance data indicators data set, and they are using data from the year prior to what I'll be looking at. So it's 2017, 2018. Their school expenditures were above the estimated adequate level in 4 of the 5 poverty quintiles, but among the highest poverty quintile, the spending was below the estimated adequate level. So based on this definition of adequacy, Maryland is actually overspending for 4 of the quintiles, but underspending in the highest poverty schools. And we're underspending in the schools where the level of resources required to achieve adequacy is far higher. All right, so in this work, I am using data from a couple of different sources. The first is the National Education Resource Database on Schools, the NERDS dataset, which has per pupil expenditures for 1,388 schools in 25 districts. The NERDS dataset actually contains data for most of the 50 states and DC. So if you're interested, you should check that out. In Maryland, the district is generally the county. There are 23 counties plus Baltimore City, and the 25th district is the seed school. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more in a few slides. Maryland also has a lot of publicly available data, pretty much everything that is in the school report card. So that includes things like school climate and access to a well-rounded curriculum. And all of the data that I'm using are from 2018, 2019. So this precedes the coronavirus pandemic. So I'll be using the data from the Maryland State Department of Education on school demographics and also on student growth percentiles in math and English language arts, and also the proficiency rates. So you'll see different charts. Some will use the student growth percentiles and some will use proficiency rates. And then finally, I use the National Center for Education Statistics, Education Demographic and Geographic Estimates that rely on household economic data from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey and public school point locations developed by NCES to estimate the income to poverty ratio for neighborhoods around school buildings. And there's an Annenberg working paper by Fazal, Codell, and Parsons that finds that free and reduced price meals overstate student poverty and provides validity evidence for the income to poverty ratio based on administrative data in Missouri. So I am going to use this income poverty ratio, which is the percentage of family income that is above or below the federal poverty threshold set for the family size and structure. All right. And the last thing I will note before I move on is that over the years, I've learned to spend a lot of time visualizing your data first. So that's what I have been doing. First thing I looked at was just the averages of per pupil spending by district. As I mentioned earlier, the seed school is a separate district. So you'll see here that for the most part, the district's average per pupil expenditure is under $20,000. For seed, it's just really, really high. And so one of the questions that I have been asking myself is, when is something an outlier? When do you decide I shouldn't include this in my analysis because it's too far outside of like the range of normal. But real students attend this school. It turned out to be like a public boarding school in Baltimore. And so it's a real school. It has real students and real taxpayers are paying money for it. And so I have not yet made any decisions about like what to not use in the data, but I'm interested in people's thoughts on how they would approach this issue, because you'll see this is not the only place where outliers are potentially a challenge. We also have some schools that serve special populations that have very high per pupil expenditure. And I dug in a little bit to see actually one of the things about these data visualizations is that every time I saw something that kind of startled me, I went down this rabbit hole of like looking up what that was and what was going on there. The website says that seed support comes from individual, community, business, philanthropic, and educational partners. It doesn't specifically say financial support, but I imagine that it's possible that their actual per pupil expenditures are higher than what we see here, which is just something to keep in the back of the mind, that what we observe here is the government investment, the per pupil state, local, and federal funding, but it's always possible that there are additional funding sources for schools. And that's something that I need to be thinking about for next steps here. Okay. So here because every other district in Maryland has more than one school besides the seed school, the district averages obscure some high per pupil expenditure schools. So here we have a box graph of the school per pupil expenditures by district. And it's a little hard to see the actual boxes here, but they display the minimum, first quartile, median, third quartile, and maximum. And then the dots are the outliers. And you can see there are a fair number of outliers. There are schools spending way more than $30,000 per student, even a handful of schools that spend more than $100,000 per student. They meet a technical definition of being outliers, but presumably are, again, real schools serving real students with real resources, and just throwing them out kind of felt strange. So I wanted to first find out a little bit more about what do we know about these schools. So it turns out that there are about 48 schools that spend $30,000 or more per student. And my best guess was that they were schools serving students with special needs. It could be that they had really high proportions of other special populations like English language learners, but only about 900 of the schools in my data set had that information. So I focused on the special education indicator at first. And was only, so there are these 48 schools and only about 35 or 36 of them actually had data on special education percentage. And so based on those schools, what I'm finding is on the left, we see that schools that are spending $30,000 or more, the per pupil expenditure, they have a much higher percentage of students receiving special education services, right? So 76% of the students in these really high per pupil expenditure schools are receiving special education services. And then in the schools that have a per pupil expenditure of under $30,000 a year, only about 12% of them receive special education services. I also looked at the free and reduced meals rate for the two groups of schools. So we see that that is a little bit lower in the schools that are spending less than $30,000 per student than it is in the schools that are spending more than $30,000 per student. But the big dramatic difference is in the schools serving special education students. And then on the right, I just have a scatter plot that's weighted by enrollment for just the schools that are spending $30,000 or more. And there's a really strong positive relationship here between the percent of students receiving special education services and per pupil expenditure. But there's also plenty of dispersion in terms of per pupil expenditure for the schools that are serving 95% or more students receiving special education services. The data are suppressed above 95%, so that's why it gets cut off there. They're spending anywhere from about $40,000 per student to nearly $120,000 per student. Some students just require a lot more services, right? And I don't know that there's a data set that I would have access to that can help break that down a little bit more. So if people have ideas about how to treat that, I'm open to suggestions. There is one school in particular that that's about $120,000. It's actually an alternative education center serving grades 6 to 9. So it's not super high in terms of serving special education students. It is relatively high in terms of serving students in poverty. And then you might wonder about where the money is coming from. So for the schools that are in the 30,000 and up bucket, nearly 11% of that is federal dollars. Whereas in the under 30K bucket, only about 6% of the funding is from federal dollars. So the high per pupil expenditure schools are relying more on federal money, although about 90% is still state and local. And it turned out that the vast majority of the schools that are spending more than $30,000 per pupil don't have student growth percentile data anyway, so they would fall out of the efficiency analysis because they don't have the data to calculate that. But they do show up in where I'm looking at equity, and so I'm open to different ideas about how to handle them, like robustness checks or running the analysis both with and without them, and any other approaches that people have in mind. Okay, so here I've limited the visualization to schools that are under $30,000 per pupil, so we can see the boxes a little bit more clearly, and you can see that most of the action is in the $12,000 to $18,000 range. There are only 2 districts where the first quartile is about $10,000 per pupil, and some districts where the third quartile is $20,000 or above. So there is definitely variation within districts. So before I jump into the next set of questions, are there any questions or comments so far? Okay. We'll jump into the next section. Oh yeah, good question, Drew. Wondering if the high spending schools are also very small. I think that's definitely one possibility and something that to take into account. It's interesting because I feel like off the top of my head, I want to say I don't think that would totally explain the patterns that I'm seeing, because I think some of the districts that look really efficient are actually in rural areas where you might expect them to have small schools. That would be expensive, but that might be one factor in explaining the differences, like just sort of economies of scale, right? Okay, so research questions. The first one is, are some districts more equitable, meaning that they provide more resources to schools serving students with more needs? And then second, are some districts more efficient? Are they more successful than others in translating resources into better student outcomes as defined by student growth percentiles? So for today, I'm just going to be focusing on the one outcome, but just something to keep in mind that we could define efficiency in a lot of different ways depending on what outcomes that we care about. And I've lived in Maryland for over 15 years, and this was a very enlightening exercise. It turned out maybe a little too enlightening because some of my research questions might need rethinking, or at least need to think about what it means to be equitable in a district that doesn't have both very wealthy schools and poor schools. And one other note is that I'm operationalizing higher need as a school located in a less wealthy neighborhood using that NCS EDGE data. Okay, so taking a step back before looking at the district level, in general across Maryland, higher poverty schools do have slightly higher per pupil expenditures. These are the averages for each quintile. The highest poverty quintile averages about 1,200 more per pupil than the moderate poverty quintile, and about 2,000 more than the lowest poverty quintile. And the figure here is using the school per pupil expenditure that adjusts for enrollment. The unadjusted, the differences in expenditure between the highest poverty and the lowest poverty is bigger, which suggests that either the large high poverty schools get less money, or maybe that the large wealthy schools are getting more money per pupil. So one of the things I'm thinking about at this point is that maybe research question 1 should be something like state and district equity. Start with this. There's some indication that funding is equitable in the sense of providing additional resources to schools serving students in poverty. And these findings are not so different than the chart on slide 8 from the school finance indicators data set, which was the prior year. And I believe also that one only focused on state and local funding, not federal funding. But it's reasonable to ask, is this adequate? Is this the amount required to achieve national average test scores? Or, as I said earlier, we're going to look at proficiency rates as a way of assessing whether the funding appears adequate to meet the goals that the state has set for the students. So here, I'm looking at the relationship between per pupil expenditures and the neighborhood income to poverty ratio. The income to poverty ratio is the percent of family income that's above or below the federal poverty threshold set for the family's size and structure, and lower values indicate a greater degree of poverty. Income at the poverty threshold corresponds to an income to poverty value of 100. So like all the way over here on the left of the chart, that is just about the poverty threshold. And on the right hand of the chart, it's the wealthier school neighborhoods. This is all the schools and all the districts, everything together, limited to the school spending less than $30,000 just for the purposes of sort of visualizing it. So you can see that there is a general downward slope. The schools in the less wealthy neighborhoods on the left are getting higher per pupil expenditure than schools in the wealthier neighborhoods on the right. And that one that's kind of at the top there is a high poverty elementary school in Prince George's County. All right, so that was statewide, and we see that schools in higher poverty neighborhoods have slightly higher per pupil expenditure. But initially, I was interested in how equity in terms of per pupil expenditure as a function of school neighborhood income to poverty ratio played out across districts. And it turned out that districts vary greatly in terms of size. This might be just an oversight on my part, not having realized this coming into the study, because my district is the largest in the state. It has over 200 schools, like 160,000 students. It's the one on the upper left corner here, right? So it's really big. It has lots of students. It has the whole range of income to poverty ratio represented in its schools. So the point of showing this here is just to say that the bigger districts in the top row, you're going to see pretty much that whole range of income to poverty ratio. And in the smaller districts, not so much, right? So we see Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and Baltimore County all have a pretty wide spread. And then on the bottom, Kent, Somerset, and Talbot have very few schools. And in the case, especially of Kent and Somerset, not a whole lot of variation in terms of the income to poverty ratio. So it's one thing to ask how equitably we distribute money in a district that has both wealthy and high poverty schools, like Montgomery and Howard and Prince George's County. We've got 7 or 8 districts in Maryland that have real range in terms of the income to poverty ratio. But what does it even mean to ask that question in a place like Kent or Somerset, which have literally no school to the right of the line here? They have very few, if any, schools in wealthy neighborhoods. So this is one challenge with looking at the within district equity. And then the last thing I wanted to share before we move on to the question about efficiency is this little peek at whether funding seems to be adequate. So here districts are sorted in order of the average income to poverty ratio from lowest to highest. And first, in general, the news is not great. The average percent proficient is just over 40% statewide. These data are from 2018-19, which is the same year as the school funding data that I have. It's also the last year the state of Maryland used the PARCC assessment. So this looks similar if you do math, but this is English language arts on the PARCC assessment. Second, it generally looks like districts with higher income to poverty ratios do better on average, although there are some exceptions to that rule. So we'll want to be thinking about why that might be the case. And third, there's a lot of spread within districts. So Prince George's County and Baltimore both have a number of outlier schools. My sense is that some of those outliers are magnet schools or possibly schools in particularly wealthy neighborhoods for that district. And here we have proficiency rates as a function of income to poverty ratios. This is English language arts again, but it looks very similar for math. So my upshot for research question 1 is that yes, in Maryland, schools in higher poverty neighborhoods receive higher per pupil funding. but there's still a relationship between poverty and proficiency rates. So in that sense, it's possibly not adequate. And at least insofar as we conceive of adequate as ensuring that most students are able to reach proficient on state exams in English language arts and math. Inefficiency might exist, but to believe that it explains this pattern, we would have to assume that it's concentrated in the high poverty schools. And I'm a little bit skeptical about that. So it's hard to say exactly what all is going on here, but I don't want to like just say that these schools are not doing a good job of using the money, because there's a pretty clear pattern that suggests that the schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods are not receiving sufficient funds to meet proficiency, at least as it's been defined by the state. Okay, so moving on to some very preliminary findings for research question 2. This is based on the concept of Roll's modified quadriform analysis, where they categorize school systems as either inefficient, because they have high input and low output, effective, meaning they have high input and high output, ineffective, meaning they have low input and low output, or efficient, which is low input and high output. So you can see there's, these are all the schools, and right, there are some that are effective, but maybe not particularly efficient because they're spending a lot of money. There's a cluster of schools that are both efficient and effective. There are these schools down on the bottom left, which are ineffective in the sense that they are both not achieving as much as we would like, and they're also, these are lower spending ones. And so the inefficient and ineffective on the bottom right are the ones that we might be particularly concerned about because they're spending a lot of money, and the student growth percentiles are not great. And so here in this chart, just wanted to point out, this is not percent proficient at this point. This is the student growth percentiles. So it's a measure of how much students are learning. And it seems like, so I drew the line at the 50th percentile for student growth percentiles. All right. And so here we're looking at student growth percentiles again by per pupil expenditure. And so first of all, yes, it looks like some districts have higher average student growth percentiles and spend less money. The ones that are circled there are Queen Anne's and St. Mary's. One implication here is that it's probably important to control for locale and cost of living adjustments. It might be that the money that they do have goes further in attracting effective educators in places that are more affordable. And then based on the student growth percentiles, this is elementary English language arts, there are certain districts that look like they're not doing so well in terms of being efficient. Here, the districts are sorted in order of average per pupil expenditures. So the lowest per pupil expenditures are all the way on the left. Is there a question?
I stopped after 4 faces popped up, and then I went to the book at the top.
Okay, districts sorted in order of average per pupil expenditures. In the previous slide, it looked like Queen Anne's and St. Mary's were efficient districts, right? And so we see them over here. They are pretty low spending relatively for Maryland. And as I said on the previous slide, it might be that this has to do with locale. And we also see the other thing to point out here is that even if we think that some districts are pretty efficient, we also see a lot of variation within districts, right? So, it's not necessarily the case that they're getting all of their schools within their district to have high student growth. There's still a lot of range within every district. Okay, so next question I have is whether or not neighborhoods play a role. So here, one factor to consider is that we might get the outcomes that we want. We might get students to proficiency, or we might have higher learning rates because of factors other than efficient school spending. So societal safety nets, because parents are hiring tutors, that hidden subsidization that I mentioned earlier. And some districts might have stronger community supports for families, right? So I'm not yet confident that what we're seeing here is entirely attributable to how the school districts allocate resources. And I'm really interested in thinking about different approaches that we might take to thinking about whether or not there are these other factors going on that might explain some of what we see in terms of the differences in student growth percentiles. And then I have other caveats as well, one of which is that there's a flag in the data file for Allegheny County, which you see up here. Like it looks, the student growth percentiles look really high, but I'm not quite sure what's going on with their from the finance data set. There was a flag in the file there. So that's something to follow up on. Okay, so efficiency metrics. This is the expenditure to performance formulas by school level and performance measure. This is following Ryan et al. To 2017, a guide to calculating district expenditure to performance ratios using publicly available data. This was a report put out by the regional educational laboratories. So I'm following the same approach to estimating these expenditure to performance formulas. Is pretty simple. Per pupil expenditure over the student growth percentiles. And we can calculate this for elementary schools and for middle schools. So in terms of descriptive statistics for these expenditure to performance ratios, what we find is that in elementary schools, a $320 increase in total per pupil expenditures is associated with a 1 percentile point increase in median student growth percentile in English language arts. Similarly, a $326 increase in total per pupil expenditure is associated with a 1 percentile point increase in the median student growth percentile in math. And then the maximums that you see over on the right are schools that serve high proportions of students receiving special education services, very high in some cases. So again, they're real students in real schools, but it's kind of hard to say what it should cost to get students to proficiency. And it's exponentially harder to say what that should look like when we're talking about students with disabilities, because again, I don't have information on how severe those disabilities are, or what kind of support students needed. And the caveat that Ryan et al. Included is that the ratios don't indicate a cause and effect relationship. They provide a basis on which to compare how conclusions about the relative efficiency of districts within a state may shift as a function of the measures of expenditures and performance used to calculate the ratios. So one of the things that's interesting about this is that you can play around with what you use as your performance indicator and say, you know, it's a school that looks efficient on one of these performance indicators, look efficient on other indicators. And so far, it looks like there are pretty high correlations between the different performance indicators. So if you just look at math or ELA, or if you look at how efficient they are in, say, math for elementary school versus math for middle school, they're all positive correlations between the different measures.
Just a quick clarifying question.
Sure.
On this ratio, it's expenditures to performance, so higher is less efficient or more efficient?
Higher is less efficient because you have to spend more to get the same amount of
Right.
To get a 1 percentile point increase. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Other questions or? Okay, so I mentioned earlier that I wasn't totally confident in my results, and that is true. And I think there's still some work to be done here. One of the things that really gave me pause is that my measure of effectiveness doesn't seem to align with what I would have guessed based on other data that is out there, right? And so the Educational Opportunity Project at Stanford University uses test scores in grades 3 through 8 in years 2008 to 2017 to calculate learning rates. So the first thing to note is like this is not the time period that I'm looking at. I'm looking at 2018-19, but I'm a little concerned because the counties that look good in based on the student growth percentile for 2018-2019 don't do especially well on this measure, right? Their learning rates from 2008 to 2017 were actually kind of low. And so it seems odd that they would be different. And it's definitely something that I want to make sure I take into consideration and try to figure out what is going on there. It's possible that they got better, right? It's just, I think, a little bit unusual that it's not just one county, it's that several of them look like they're doing well on student growth percentiles in 2018-19 in a way that they don't look on the learning rates from previous years. And then there are several different data sources that might be valuable to include. So one is the school finance indicators database that has the information on, they have an estimate of what they think it would cost to have an adequate education. And there are other accountability indicators from the Maryland State Department of Education data set. They have, like I said, everything that's in the school report card is available in the Maryland data. So things like the student surveys and also educator surveys and measures of the school access to a well-rounded curriculum. So there's all different things I could explore there. And then I also want to look into indicators of teacher experience or other qualifications, because so much of school budgets is about the staff. And so I think that's probably an important factor here. There is also additional state data from NERDS. And so it might be interesting to look into, especially DC and Virginia, because I think that those would be most relevant for Maryland's teacher labor market. And some additional analyses, what might explain the observed differences across districts in efficiency. I want to look into the role of demographics, locale and cost of living, magnet schools. I think I mentioned earlier that some of the schools that seem to stand out in these analyses may have been magnet schools. You could also look at charter schools, but Maryland only has 48 charter schools according to the Common Core data, and they're concentrated in, I think, 2 districts. So I'm not sure how much I can say about charter schools, just given the state that I happen to choose to look at. And then last, and probably most importantly, is the labor market. District potential to grow their own, proximity to institutions of higher education, and also competition from neighboring districts, neighboring districts that might be higher paying. So for example, DCPS is a fairly well-paying district, and it might be competing with Montgomery County and Prince George's County for teachers. So I think all of those could be factors. Also, one thing that we know about the labor market is the teachers tend to teach either near home or near where they went to school. So I would expect those things might be shaping expenditures and efficiency in ways that are hard to unpack from just looking at how much we spend. And that is all I have for my slides, but I'll open it up for questions. As you've probably noticed throughout this presentation, I asked questions and I just ended up having more questions. So I'm happy to hear from you about what you would do next.